Here's the paradox no one's talking about. The US dollar controls 88% of all global currency trades, yet 45% of the world's population just announced they're building a system to bypass it entirely. Not in a decade, not as a distant threat, right now. And the strangest part, most Western analysts are still dismissing this as economic fantasy, while 90% of trade between BRICS nations has already shifted to local currencies. This isn't speculation about what might happen. This is documentation of what's already underway. And the mechanism behind it reveals something far more significant than a currency war. Vladimir Petrov still remembers the exact moment he realized his life savings had become a political weapon. February 2022, a Tuesday morning in his small Moscow apartment. The 53-year-old high school mathematics teacher had spent 11 years accumulating foreign stocks through a Russian brokerage. Modest amounts. About $42,000 in Apple, Microsoft, a few European ETFs. His retirement fund. His daughter's future university tuition. He logged into his account that morning, expecting to check his portfolio performance. Instead, he found a single message. Assets frozen due to international sanctions. No warning, no appeal process, no timeline for resolution. Vladimir sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours, staring at his phone, unable to move. Here's what most people get wrong about the BRICS digital currency story. They see it as an attack on America, a coordinated assault by hostile nations trying to destroy Western financial dominance. The headlines scream about economic warfare, about revenge, about geopolitical chess moves between superpowers. But that framing misses the fundamental truth buried beneath the rhetoric. Picture a screen showing the BRICS Pay interface demonstration from the October 2024 Kazan summit, then slowly pulling back to reveal a map of participating nations spanning from Sao Paulo to Shanghai. This isn't primarily about hurting America. It's about something far more basic. It's about millions of ordinary people like Vladimir, who discovered overnight that the global financial system wasn't designed for them. It was designed to control them. And that realization, spreading across nations representing 45% of humanity, has set in motion something the architects of dollar dominance never anticipated. Consider Maria Santos, 37. A coffee exporter from Sao Paulo. For 15 years, she ran a mid-sized operation, shipping premium Brazilian beans to buyers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Every transaction went through the same ritual. Her buyers paid in dollars. Those dollars passed through American correspondent banks. Each transfer cost her between 3 and 7% in fees and conversion charges. Each payment took 3 to 5 business days. And every single transaction, without exception, was visible to American financial regulators. This is simply how international trade worked. Not because it was efficient, not because it served her interests, but because no alternative existed. Why does a Brazilian woman selling coffee to a German company need American permission to complete the transaction? That question used to sound naive. The answer seemed obvious. The dollar was the lingua franca of global commerce. Everyone used it because everyone else used it. Network effects, convenience, stability. These were the explanations economists offered, and for decades they were good enough. Then came March 2024. Russian news agency TASS reported that BRICS nations had begun developing a blockchain-based payment system. The initiative, tentatively called BRICS Bridge, would connect member countries' financial systems through digital gateways. Settlements in central bank digital currencies. No American intermediaries. No SWIFT messaging system. No 3-day delays. No permission required from Washington. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov framed it with clinical precision. We believe that creating an independent BRICS payment system is an important goal for the future, he said. The main thing is to make sure it is convenient for governments, common people, and businesses, as well as cost-effective and free of politics. Convenient, cost-effective, free of politics. 3 words that summarize the entire motivation behind the largest monetary realignment in modern history. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Jiang Wei sat in his office at a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Shenzhen, crunching numbers that didn't make sense. The 41-year-old export manager had been tracking his company's payment flows for a decade. In 2023, something shifted. Payments from Russian buyers that used to take a week started arriving in 2 days. The conversion losses dropped from 5% to under 1%. When he traced the change, he discovered his finance department had quietly switched to yuan-ruble direct settlement. No dollars involved, no American banks in the chain. The efficiency gain translated to roughly $400,000 in annual savings for his company alone. Jiang wasn't making a political statement. He was following the numbers. Imagine a split-screen visualization. On one side, the traditional dollar payment route with its multiple intermediaries, fees deducted at each node. On the other side, the direct BRICS payment pathway, streamlined and direct. Here's the data point that should keep Washington awake at night. In 2022, approximately 65% of trade between BRICS nations settled in local currencies. By mid-2024, that figure had jumped to 90%. Not because governments mandated it, because businesses chose it. The efficiency advantage was simply too large to ignore. But efficiency alone doesn't explain the acceleration. The deeper driver lies in an event that occurred on February 26, 2022. When Western nations froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in foreign jurisdictions. The message was unmistakable. Dollar-denominated assets aren't really yours. They exist at the pleasure of American policymakers. And if you find yourself on the wrong side of Washington's geopolitical interests, decades of accumulated reserves can vanish with a keystroke. The dollar is no longer just a currency, it's become a weapon, and weapons tend to inspire the development of countermeasures. Consider what that freeze looked like from New Delhi, or Pretoria, or Brasilia. These governments hold trillions in dollar reserves. They've structured their entire financial systems around dollar dominance, and they watched as one of the world's largest economies was financially amputated from the global system in a matter of days. Not through military force, through banking protocols. The implications were impossible to miss. Priya Sharma, 44, manages foreign exchange operations at a major Indian bank. In March 2022, her department received an unusual directive from senior management. Conduct a comprehensive review of all dollar-denominated exposure. Model scenarios for reduced dollar access. Identify alternative settlement mechanisms for key trading partners. She spent the next 6 months building contingency frameworks she never imagined would be necessary. We weren't anti-American, she told colleagues at the time. We were risk managers. And the risk profile of dollar concentration had fundamentally changed overnight. Why would countries holding trillions in dollar reserves voluntarily reduce their exposure to the world's most liquid and stable currency? That question contains its own answer. Stability depends on predictability, and predictability evaporated the moment reserves became subject to political confiscation. The countries now building alternatives aren't rejecting the dollar because they hate America. They're building alternatives because prudent financial management requires it. The same logic that once drove dollar accumulation now drives dollar diversification. At the July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio, leaders confirmed what many analysts still refuse to believe. No single BRICS currency would launch in the near term. Instead, the focus shifted to BRICS Pay, a cross-border payment platform designed to make dollar circumvention seamless and scalable. Not a dollar replacement, a dollar bypass. The distinction matters. A graphic showing the BRICS Pay architecture. Decentralized nodes, encrypted messaging protocols, automatic currency conversion between participating national currencies. The system's technical specifications reveal its true ambition. The decentralized cross-border messaging system, developed at St. Petersburg State University, operates without any central owner or hub. Participants manage their own nodes. The architecture makes the system resistant to external control or interference. Translation: immune to the kind of financial sanctions that crippled Russia's connection to SWIFT. China fully backed BRICS Pay in October 2024. The yuan's share of global forex trades climbed to 8.5% by September 2025. Russia reported yuan-ruble trading volume hit $420 billion in 2024. These aren't projections. These are transactions already completed. And Vladimir Petrov? 3 years after watching his savings freeze, he discovered something unexpected. A mutual unblocking program allowed him to recover assets worth up to about $1,000 out of $42,000. He teaches mathematics classes now to pay for his daughter's education. He'll retire later than planned. Much later. But he also learned something that textbooks never taught. In a world where money can be frozen with a memo, the currency you trust matters less than the system you can control. The question isn't whether BRICS will succeed in displacing the dollar. That framing misses the point entirely. The question is, what happens to a financial system built on universal trust once a critical mass of participants decides that trust was misplaced? And the answer to that question is already taking shape. Transaction by transaction, node by node, in a decentralized network that Washington can't freeze, can't monitor, and increasingly can't ignore. What comes next will determine whether the dollar's dominance survives the decade. But first, you need to understand how we arrived at this moment. And that story begins not in Moscow or Beijing, but in a small town in New Hampshire, 80 years ago, where the architects of American financial supremacy made a bet they assumed could never be called. July 1944. A small resort town called Bretton Woods, nestled in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel to rebuild the global financial system from the wreckage of World War II. Europe lay in ruins. The British Empire was bleeding money, and the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The delegates faced a simple question with profound implications. What would the world use for money? The answer they constructed would shape the next 8 decades of human history. Picture the grand ballroom of the Mount Washington Hotel. Delegates in suits gathered around tables covered with currency charts and economic projections, cigarette smoke hanging in the air. The fate of the global economy being decided by men who understood they were designing a system that would outlast them all. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's legendary economist, proposed something radical. An international currency called the Bancor, managed by a global central bank. No single nation would control it. No country would enjoy unfair advantage. The system would be balanced, neutral, designed to prevent the kind of currency manipulation that had contributed to 2 world wars. Harry Dexter White, the American delegate, had a different idea. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. The dollar would peg to gold. America would guarantee convertibility at $35 per ounce. Keynes understood what this meant. Whoever controls the reserve currency controls the rules. But Britain was bankrupt, and America was ascendant. The vote wasn't close. Here's what most people get wrong about the Bretton Woods system. They think it was designed to create stability. It was designed to create control. Every international transaction would flow through dollar channels. Every central bank would hold dollar reserves. Every country that wanted to participate in global trade would need American currency to do it. The system wasn't neutral. It was architecture, and the architect held all the blueprints. Think of it like a highway system. where every road passes through a single toll booth. You can drive anywhere you want. You can trade with anyone you choose. But every journey requires a ticket that only one country can print. And that country gets to decide who travels and who stays home. The system worked remarkably well for 27 years. Then came the first crack. August 15, 1971. Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. The speech lasted 18 minutes. The consequences are still unfolding. Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the fixed rate. The gold window was closing. The Bretton Woods system, as designed, was dead. What replaced it was something unprecedented in monetary history: a global reserve currency backed by nothing but faith. Faith in American institutions, faith in American military power, faith in the continued willingness of the world to accept green paper in exchange for real goods and real labor. The economists called it fiat currency. The rest of the world called it the only option available. Remember Maria Santos from Part 1, the Brazilian coffee exporter paying 7% on every international transaction? Her grandfather, Roberto Santos, was 23 years old in 1971. He'd just taken over his family's small coffee farm when the Nixon shock hit. Within months, the Brazilian Cruzeiro had lost 30% of its value against the dollar. His export contracts, priced in dollars, suddenly couldn't cover his production costs. Roberto spent the next decade watching his margins evaporate as currency fluctuations consumed profits that should have gone to equipment and expansion. 3 generations later, his granddaughter still pays tribute to the same system that nearly bankrupted him. The fee structure changed. The fundamental dependency didn't. But here's where the mechanism gets interesting. How does the United States maintain dollar dominance without gold backing? The answer lies in a network most people have never heard of: SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Founded in 1973, headquartered in Belgium, technically controlled by a cooperative of international banks, SWIFT doesn't move money. It moves messages about money. When Maria Santos sells coffee to a German buyer, SWIFT transmits the payment instructions between their banks. When Vladimir Petrov purchased Apple stock through his Russian brokerage, SWIFT messages coordinated the settlement. Visualize the SWIFT network as a nervous system spanning the globe. Fiber optic cables carrying encrypted messages between 11,000 financial institutions in over 200 countries. Every international payment pulsing through this network, like signals through neurons. Here's the critical detail. SWIFT is based in Belgium and governed by Belgian law, but the United States exercises enormous influence over its operations. American banks process the majority of dollar transactions. American regulators can demand records. American sanctions can disconnect institutions from the network entirely. In theory, SWIFT is international. In practice, it's an extension of American financial power. The money doesn't have to touch American soil for America to control it. Consider what this means. Every dollar transaction in the world, regardless of where it originates or terminates, can be monitored by American authorities. Every participant in the dollar system operates with the implicit understanding that access is a privilege, not a right, and that privilege can be revoked. Chen Xiaoming learned this lesson in 2018. The 47-year-old ran a trading company in Guangzhou that sourced auto parts from Iran. Legal under Chinese law, profitable for his business. Then American secondary sanctions hit. His company's correspondent bank in Hong Kong received notice that processing payments to Iranian suppliers would jeopardize its access to the dollar system. The bank had no choice. Chen's accounts were frozen within the week. His Iranian contracts became worthless paper. He spent the next year untangling relationships that had taken a decade to build. Not because he broke Chinese law. Not because he threatened American security. Because his business model required a currency that someone else controlled. This is the mechanism behind dollar dominance. It's not just that countries want dollars. It's that the system makes alternatives nearly impossible. International trade requires international payments. International payments require messaging networks. The dominant messaging network operates under American influence. The logic is circular by design. Now here's the contrarian point that challenges conventional wisdom about de-dollarization. The dollar's critics argue that its dominance is artificial, maintained through coercion rather than merit. The dollar's defenders argue that dominance reflects genuine superiority, that the depth and liquidity of American financial markets simply can't be matched. Both arguments miss the deeper truth. The dollar's dominance is self-reinforcing, precisely because breaking the cycle carries enormous costs. It's not that alternatives don't exist. It's that switching to alternatives means abandoning the network effects that make the current system efficient. Imagine you're a small business owner, and everyone in your industry uses the same accounting software. The software is expensive. The company that makes it sometimes changes the terms unfairly. But all your suppliers use it. All your customers use it. All your banks can read its files. Switching to something else would mean retraining your staff, convincing your partners to switch too, and accepting months of friction during the transition. The software isn't better. It's just embedded. And embedded systems are remarkably hard to dislodge. This is why, despite decades of complaints, despite the Asian financial crisis of 1997, despite the global financial crisis of 2008, despite the increasing weaponization of financial sanctions, the dollar's share of global reserves barely budged. In 1999, the dollar represented about 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2020, that figure had declined to roughly 59%. 21 years, 12 percentage points. Glacial. But glaciers can crack. March 2022 marked the moment when gradual erosion became potential rupture. When Western nations froze Russian reserves, they didn't just punish Russia. They demonstrated to every central bank on Earth that dollar reserves carry counterparty risk. The safe asset wasn't safe. The neutral infrastructure wasn't neutral. The rules could change overnight based on decisions made in Washington. Remember Vladimir Petrov, the mathematics teacher from Part 1, watching his retirement savings disappear? Multiply his experience by 3.5 million. That's how many Russian citizens lost access to foreign securities frozen under EU sanctions. The overwhelming majority held assets worth less than $1,300. Small savers, middle-class investors, people who believed that participating in global markets meant sharing in global protection. They learned otherwise. And in central bank offices from New Delhi to Riyadh to Brasilia, risk managers drew the same conclusion. If it happened to Russia, it could happen to anyone. The cost of dollar dependence had always been theoretical. Now it was documented, quantified, undeniable. What happens when the foundation of a financial system stops being trusted by the people who built their economies on top of it? That question hung in the air at the October 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, where Vladimir Putin stood on stage holding what appeared to be a prototype BRICS banknote. The image was symbolic. The substance was already operational. BRICS Pay, BRICS Bridge, bilateral swap lines totaling hundreds of billions in local currencies, digital yuan settlements expanding across Asia and Africa. A parallel financial infrastructure rising in the shadow of the one that Bretton Woods built. The next section will reveal how this alternative system actually works, who benefits, who loses, and why the timeline for change is accelerating faster than most analysts predicted. But first, understand what's really at stake. This isn't a story about currencies competing for market share. It's a story about who writes the rules of global commerce. For 80 years, the answer was unambiguous. That certainty is ending, and what replaces it will determine the financial futures of billions of people who never asked to be caught between great powers playing monetary chess with their savings. The official story goes like this. BRICS nations are building an alternative payment system because they want to challenge American hegemony. It's geopolitics. Great power competition. The inevitable clash between rising challengers and the incumbent superpower. Western analysts frame it as aggression. BRICS officials frame it as self-defense. Both framings serve their purposes. Both framings miss the point. Here's what's actually happening, and it has almost nothing to do with the narratives you've been fed. In December 2024, Donald Trump posted a direct threat on Truth Social. Any BRICS nation creating a new currency or backing alternatives to the dollar would face 100% tariffs and lose access to American markets. The message was unambiguous: comply or suffer. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov responded within hours. If the U.S. uses economic force to compel countries to use the dollar, it will further strengthen the trend of switching to national currencies. Pause on that exchange for a moment. The world's largest economy threatened to economically devastate nations representing 45% of global population. The response wasn't fear. It was acceleration. Why would countries risk American retaliation to build payment systems they don't urgently need? The answer lies in a document most people have never seen. The BRICS Bridge Technical Specifications, developed by Russian and Chinese financial engineers, outline a system designed not just to bypass SWIFT, but to make SWIFT obsolete for participating nations. Decentralized nodes, no central authority. Encrypted messaging with multiple redundancy pathways. The architecture ensures that even if one country faces sanctions, the network continues functioning for everyone else. Visualize a web of interconnected nodes, spanning from Moscow to Mumbai to Johannesburg to Sao Paulo. Each node independently capable of routing transactions. No single point of failure. No single authority capable of shutting down the network. This isn't a backup system. It's a replacement infrastructure being built in plain sight, while Western analysts debate whether it's technically feasible. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The biggest beneficiaries of BRICS Pay won't be governments. They'll be corporations. Specifically, the same multinational corporations that currently profit from dollar dominance. Consider the numbers. Cross-border payment fees generated approximately $120 billion in revenue for financial institutions in 2023. The majority of that revenue flowed to American and European banks. BRICS Pay promises near zero transaction fees, with settlement times measured in seconds rather than days. For a company like the one Zhang Wei manages in Shenzhen, the one we mentioned in Part 1, switching to BRICS settlement saved $400,000 annually. Scale that across millions of businesses, and you understand why corporate adoption is outpacing government implementation. The irony cuts deep. American sanctions designed to punish adversaries are creating financial incentives for American allies to adopt alternative systems. Let me tell you about someone who embodies this contradiction. James Morrison, 51, runs procurement for a mid-sized American manufacturing company based in Ohio. His job involves sourcing components from suppliers in 12 countries, including India, Brazil, and South Africa. Every month, his company processes roughly $8 million in international payments. Every month, approximately $240,000 disappears into fees, currency conversion losses, and correspondent banking charges. That's nearly $3 million annually. Money that could fund equipment upgrades, worker bonuses, American jobs. James discovered BRICS Pay during a trade conference in Dubai. An Indian supplier mentioned casually that payments through the new system arrived in hours instead of days, with fees under 1%. James brought the information back to his CFO. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. "We can't be seen using a Russian-Chinese payment system," the CFO said. "The reputational risk is too high." $3 million a year, sacrificed to avoid headlines. What most people get wrong about the BRICS financial revolution is the assumption that it threatens American consumers. The opposite is true. American businesses and consumers are among those most harmed by the current system. They pay higher prices because their suppliers pay higher transaction costs. They wait longer for goods because payments take longer to clear. They subsidize a financial infrastructure that extracts rent at every stage of the supply chain. The system doesn't serve Americans. It serves American banks. There's a difference. Microhook. What happened next will explain why the timeline for change suddenly accelerated from decades to years. October 2024, the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia. 45 heads of state and government representatives gathered to formalize what had been building in back channels for years. The summit produced the Kazan Declaration, a document that received minimal Western media coverage, despite containing provisions that will reshape global finance for generations. Among the key announcements, BRICS Clear, a settlement system for securities trading that bypasses Western depositories. Expansion of the new development banks lending in local currencies. Standardized protocols for central bank digital currency interoperability. And crucially, the formal endorsement of BRICS Pay as the bloc's preferred cross-border payment mechanism. Picture the summit hall in Kazan. Flags of 10 nations arranged in a semicircle. Putin at the podium, holding the prototype BRICS banknote. Cameras from 70 countries broadcasting the image, while American networks ran segments about domestic political scandals. The visual was theater. The substance was architecture. Remember Chen Xiaoming from Part 2? The auto parts trader whose business was destroyed by secondary sanctions? He was in Kazan. Not as a delegate, as an observer, watching the system that had crushed his livelihood be systematically dismantled. "I felt like someone watching their jailer's prison being demolished," he told colleagues afterward. The walls were still standing, but you could see the cracks. Now comes the rage moment, the part of this story that should make you furious regardless of your politics. While BRICS nations build infrastructure to protect their citizens from financial weaponization, what has America built? Consider the asymmetry. When Russian central bank reserves were frozen, approximately $300 billion was locked in Western depositories. The interest generated on those frozen assets, held primarily at Euroclear in Belgium, amounts to roughly $3 billion annually. That money, generated by Russian reserves, is now being discussed as a funding mechanism for Ukraine. Set aside the geopolitics. Focus on the mechanism. A country's sovereign reserves, accumulated over decades of commodity exports, can be frozen without judicial process, and the interest generated can be redirected to that country's enemies. No trial, no conviction, no appeal. Just policy decisions made by officials in Washington and Brussels. Now apply that mechanism to any country, to your pension fund's foreign holdings. If American reserves were frozen by a foreign power and the interest redirected to fund operations against American interests, what would we call it? We'd call it theft. We'd call it an act of war. We'd mobilize every resource to prevent it from ever happening again. And that's exactly what BRICS nations are doing. Not because they love Russia, not because they hate America, because they watched what happened and drew the rational conclusion. Any country holding dollar reserves is holding assets that can be confiscated at American discretion. The only protection is not holding those assets in the first place. The consequences of this realization are already visible in central bank behavior. Gold purchases by BRICS central banks reached record levels in 2023 and 2024. China has reduced its treasury holdings by over $200 billion since 2021. India signed currency swap agreements worth billions with Russia, the UAE, and other partners. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're risk management. The dollar didn't lose its dominance because enemies attacked it. The dollar is losing its dominance because friends stopped trusting it. Let me introduce you to someone whose story crystallizes the human stakes. Amara Okonkwo, 39, works as a treasury analyst at a Nigerian sovereign wealth fund. Her job is to protect her country's reserves against currency fluctuations and geopolitical risk. Before 2022, her portfolio allocation was straightforward: 60% dollar assets, 20% euros. The rest diversified across stable currencies. Safe, conventional, what every textbook recommended. After February 2022, her risk models broke. The assumptions underlying them, that sovereign reserves held in major currencies were inviolable, no longer held. She spent months rebuilding her framework. The new allocation? 40% gold and commodities, 30% yuan-denominated assets, 20% diversified local currencies, 10% dollars and euros. Her supervisor questioned the shift. "The dollar is still the safest asset," he argued. Amara's response has become something of a legend in sovereign wealth circles. Safe for whom? Safe until when? And who decides? Those three questions now echo through central bank offices across the global south. Safe for whom? Safe until when? Who decides? The answers no longer favor the dollar. Second micro hook. What you're about to learn will explain why this shift is irreversible. Here's the contrarian point that most analysis ignores. BRICS isn't trying to destroy dollar dominance. BRICS is trying to make dollar dominance irrelevant. The distinction matters enormously. Destroying the dollar would require direct confrontation, massive economic disruption, and coordinated action that the diverse BRICS membership could never sustain. Making the dollar irrelevant requires only one thing: building alternatives that work better for participants. The dollar doesn't need to collapse. It just needs to stop being necessary. This is why American threats have failed to slow the transition. Tariffs punish countries for using alternatives, but they don't make the alternatives less attractive. If anything, tariffs accelerate adoption by demonstrating exactly the kind of arbitrary economic coercion that alternatives were designed to escape. The weapon defeats itself by being used. Consider the math. 90% of trade between BRICS nations now settles in local currencies. The yuan's share of global forex trading reached 8.5% in 2025, up from 4% in 2019. China-Russia bilateral trade hit $245 billion in 2024, almost entirely in yuan and rubles. These aren't projections. These are completed transactions in systems that didn't exist a decade ago. Remember Maria Santos, the Brazilian coffee exporter from Part 1? She received her first yuan-denominated payment last year. The fee was 0.8%. The settlement time was 4 hours. Her message to her grandfather Roberto, who nearly lost the family farm to currency fluctuations in the 1970s, would have been simple if he were still alive. The toll booth finally has competition. The dominance that took 80 years to build is eroding in real time. And once the infrastructure exists, once the network effects tip, once a critical mass of transactions flows through alternative channels, the process becomes self-reinforcing. Each country that reduces dollar exposure makes it easier for the next country to follow. Each successful transaction proves the system works. Each American sanction validates the decision to build alternatives. But here's what Western analysts consistently underestimate. The shift isn't just about finance. It's about dignity, about sovereignty, about the right of nations to conduct commerce without seeking permission from Washington. And that's a motivation that no tariff can counter and no threat can contain. What comes next will determine whether this transition remains orderly or turns chaotic. The mechanisms are in place. The incentives are aligned. The only remaining question is speed. And as you're about to see, the forces accelerating this timeline are far more powerful than the forces trying to slow it down. The forces accelerating this timeline became visible in the first quarter of 2025, and they came from a direction nobody predicted. Amara Okonkwo received the call at 3 a.m. Lagos time. Her counterpart at the South African Reserve Bank, a veteran named Thabo Molefe, spoke in clipped sentences. The Saudis just moved. 40 billion in treasury holdings, liquidated overnight. Beijing confirmed the swap. Amara sat up in bed, her mind racing through the implications. "That's not diversification," she said. "That's a signal." Tabo's voice carried exhaustion and something else. Fear. The signal is already sent. The question is, who receives it first? The Saudi move hadn't been announced publicly. It wouldn't be for another 6 weeks. But in the tight network of sovereign wealth managers, information travels faster than press releases. Within 72 hours, Amara watched her colleagues across 3 continents adjust their positions. Not dramatically, not publicly, but unmistakably. The herd was turning. What the financial press missed in those critical weeks was the coordination happening below the surface. BRICS finance ministers had established encrypted communication channels specifically to avoid the monitoring capabilities embedded in Western financial infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on participants. They were using the same operational security techniques that intelligence agencies employed, applied to treasury management. Because in 2025, treasury management had become a form of economic warfare. Jiang Wei noticed the shift in his payment patterns before he understood its cause. His Shenzhen manufacturing firm had processed yuan settlements for 3 years. The volumes were steady, predictable. Then in February 2025, they spiked. New customers from countries he'd never served. Indonesian distributors, Egyptian importers, Ethiopian textile manufacturers, all requesting yuan invoicing, all citing the same reason when he asked. Dollar payments got complicated, an Indonesian buyer told him. Too many questions from banks, too many delays. Yuan just works. The American banking system had become its own worst enemy. James Morrison, the Ohio procurement manager we met earlier, watched his competitive position erode in real time. His Indian suppliers started offering 5% discounts to customers who paid in rupees. His Brazilian partners quoted lower prices for yuan settlements. The $3 million his company lost annually to dollar transaction fees was now joined by price disadvantages against competitors who'd adopted alternative systems. He brought the numbers to his board in March 2025. The meeting lasted 2 hours. The decision took 30 seconds. "We can't be the company that legitimizes Chinese financial infrastructure," the CEO said. "Find other suppliers." James spent the next month searching for alternatives. There weren't any. Not at competitive prices, not with comparable quality. The global supply chain had reorganized around payment efficiency, and his company was stuck paying a premium for political optics. "Do you know what kills me?" James told his wife that night. "The executives making these decisions don't pay the costs. Their bonuses don't shrink. Their jobs aren't threatened. It's the factory workers who lose overtime when margins collapse. It's the middle managers who get cut when we can't compete. The people at the top get to feel righteous. The people at the bottom get to feel unemployed." His wife asked the question he'd been avoiding. "How long before they have to change?" James stared at the ceiling. "Longer than we can afford to wait." Meanwhile, in Moscow, Vladimir Petrov had found unexpected purpose in his financial devastation. The mathematics teacher, whose retirement savings vanished in 2022, had become something of a local expert on alternative payment systems. His neighbors sought his advice. Former colleagues asked him to explain the new digital ruble. He'd spent 3 years studying the systems that had destroyed his wealth, and that knowledge now had value. A local business owner approached him in April 2025. Dmitry Volkov, 43, ran a small export company shipping industrial equipment to Central Asian markets. "The banks are pushing us to use the new settlement system," Dmitry said. "I don't understand how it works. I don't trust what I don't understand." Vladimir spent an evening walking Dmitry through the architecture. The digital ruble operated on a centralized blockchain maintained by the Russian Central Bank. Transactions settled in seconds. Fees were minimal. Cross-border payments to participating countries bypassed SWIFT entirely. The system had limitations. It couldn't process transactions with Western counterparts. But for trade within the BRICS sphere, it was faster, cheaper, and immune to sanctions. "What's the catch?" Dmitry asked. Vladimir considered the question carefully. "The catch is that you're trusting a different set of institutions. Before, you trusted American banks and European clearinghouses. Now you trust Russian and Chinese systems. The question isn't which system is perfect. The question is, which system serves your interests?" Dmitry signed up the following week. His first transaction, a shipment of mining equipment to Kazakhstan, cleared in 4 hours. The fee was 0.3%. His previous dollar-based payments had taken 5 days and cost 4.7%. The math was undeniable. This pattern repeated across thousands of businesses throughout the BRICS sphere, not because governments mandated adoption, because economic incentives made resistance irrational. The system that worked better won users. The system that extracted excessive fees lost them. Market forces, the same forces that Western economists celebrated in theory, were dismantling Western financial dominance in practice. But the truly destabilizing development came from an unexpected source. In May 2025, a consortium of European manufacturers petitioned the European Central Bank for guidance on BRICS Pay integration. The petition wasn't public. The signatories included automotive suppliers, pharmaceutical companies, and industrial equipment manufacturers. Their request was simple. They wanted legal clarity on whether European companies could use BRICS settlement systems for transactions with BRICS counterparts. The ECB's response, leaked to the Financial Times 3 weeks later, sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. The bank acknowledged that no explicit prohibition existed. European companies could, in principle, use any settlement system legal in their jurisdiction. BRICS Pay operated under Russian and Chinese law. Using it for transactions with Russian or Chinese counterparts didn't violate EU sanctions as currently written. Washington's reaction was immediate and furious. "Let me be clear," the Treasury Secretary said in a hastily arranged press conference. "Any financial institution that facilitates transactions through systems designed to evade American oversight will face consequences. We will use every tool available to protect the integrity of the international financial system." But the threat rang hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. European companies weren't evading anything. They were optimizing costs. They were serving shareholders. They were doing exactly what capitalism demanded. The only thing they were evading was American fees. Chen Xiaoming watched the press conference from his rebuilt office in Guangzhou. The man whose auto parts business had been destroyed by secondary sanctions in 2018 had spent 7 years reconstructing his network. His new company traded exclusively with BRICS nations. His payments never touched dollar channels. His counterparties were carefully screened to avoid any American nexus. "They're threatening Europeans now," his assistant observed. "How long before they threaten everyone?" Chen smiled without humor. They've been threatening everyone for years. The difference is that now people have somewhere else to go. The somewhere else was becoming more concrete by the day. BRICS Bridge completed its pilot phase in June 2025, processing over $12 billion in transactions during the testing period. The system connected central banks in Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa through standardized digital currency gateways. Settlement was instantaneous. Costs were negligible. And most importantly, the system operated entirely outside Western jurisdiction. The technical achievement was impressive. The political implications were revolutionary. Consider what instantaneous settlement means for countries managing foreign exchange reserves. Traditional dollar settlements required maintaining buffer stocks to cover payment delays. A country expecting $1 billion in export revenue might need to hold $200 million in liquid dollar reserves just to manage cash flow timing. With instantaneous settlement, those buffer requirements evaporated. Countries could operate with leaner reserve positions. They could deploy capital more productively. The efficiency gains compounded across entire economies. Maria Santos felt this shift in her daily operations. The Brazilian coffee exporter, who'd spent her career paying tribute to the dollar system, received her first BRICS Bridge payment in July 2025. A shipment to an Indian buyer, $240,000 equivalent in rupee-yuan settlement. The payment arrived before her cargo ship reached Mumbai. "I've been in this business for 15 years, she told her operations manager. "I've never seen money move faster than goods." Her grandfather Roberto had died in 2019, but she kept his photograph in her office. The man who'd nearly lost everything to currency fluctuations in the 1970s. The man who'd taught her that international trade was a game rigged against small players. She wondered what he'd think of this moment. A Brazilian woman settling trades in Asian currencies through systems that American banks couldn't touch. It would have seemed like science fiction to him. It seemed like justice to her. But the justice came with complications. Priya Sharma, the Indian bank foreign exchange manager from Part 1, faced a dilemma that crystallized the tensions of the transition period. Her institution served clients on both sides of the emerging divide. Multinational corporations needed dollar services for Western operations. Domestic companies increasingly wanted rupee and yuan capabilities. Running parallel systems meant parallel costs. Choosing one system meant losing customers to competitors who chose differently. "We're being asked to pick sides in a financial war," she told her risk committee in August 2025. "But our clients don't want sides. They want efficiency. They want optionality. They want us to solve problems that governments created." The committee debated for 6 hours. The decision, when it came, was pragmatic rather than political. The bank would maintain full dollar capabilities while building BRICS integration for interested clients. They would let customers choose their preferred systems. They would be neutral infrastructure providers in a world that increasingly demanded allegiance. "It's not sustainable," one committee member warned. "Eventually, we'll have to commit." Priya nodded. "Eventually is not today. Today, we serve our clients." The neutrality strategy worked until it didn't. In September 2025, the United States Treasury Department issued new guidance on correspondent banking relationships. Any bank maintaining active BRICS Pay integration would face enhanced due diligence requirements for dollar transactions. Compliance costs would increase. Processing times would lengthen. The guidance stopped short of prohibition, but the intent was clear. Washington was forcing institutions to choose. Priya's phone rang within hours of the announcement. Her largest corporate client, a pharmaceutical manufacturer with operations in 30 countries, wanted clarity. "Can you still process our dollar payments if you're also running BRICS transactions?" "Technically, yes," Priya said. "Practically, there will be delays, additional documentation, possible scrutiny." "How much delay?" We don't know yet. The guidance is deliberately vague. Silence on the line. Then, we can't afford uncertainty. Our supply chain requires predictable payment timing. If you can't guarantee that, we'll need to find banks that can. The client moved their account within the month. $3 billion in annual transaction volume. Gone. Not to a competitor that avoided BRICS integration. To a competitor that avoided dollar integration. The pharmaceutical company had decided that the BRICS market mattered more than the American one. They weren't alone. This was the moment when the trickle became a flood. Throughout the fall of 2025, multinational corporations began splitting their banking relationships along geographic lines. Western operations used Western banks. Eastern operations used Eastern banks. The integrated global financial system that had characterized the post-Cold War era was fragmenting into regional blocks. Not because ideology demanded it, because compliance costs required it. Amara Okonkwo tracked the fragmentation from her position at the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Her diversification strategy, once considered aggressive, now looked conservative. Countries that had maintained heavy dollar exposure were scrambling to rebalance. Countries that had diversified early found themselves with competitive advantages. "We got lucky," her supervisor admitted in their October review meeting. "You called this before most people saw it coming." Amara shook her head. It wasn't luck. It was paying attention. The signals were there for anyone who wanted to see them. Not everyone wanted to see them. No, and now they're learning what willful blindness costs. The costs were becoming visible in unexpected places. American agricultural exporters reported losing market share in Asia and Africa. Not because their products were inferior, because their payment requirements were burdensome. Buyers who could settle in local currencies through BRICS channels preferred suppliers who accepted those settlements. American farmers found themselves priced out of markets their parents had dominated. The Trump administration's response was predictable and counterproductive. More tariffs. More threats. More sanctions on institutions facilitating BRICS transactions. Each escalation validated the original premise of BRICS financial infrastructure. Each punishment proved why alternatives were necessary. "They're playing checkers in a chess game," Zhang Wei observed during a dinner with fellow exporters in Shenzhen. "Every move they make creates 3 new opportunities for us." His colleague, a woman who'd built a logistics company serving BRICS trade routes, laughed bitterly. "They think they're punishing us. They're training us. Every sanction teaches us what we still depend on them for. Every restriction shows us what we need to build ourselves." The self-sufficiency imperative drove innovation at remarkable speed. Chinese semiconductor companies, cut off from American technology, accelerated domestic development programs. Russian software firms, excluded from Western markets, built alternatives that spread across the BRICS sphere. Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers, facing regulatory barriers in America, pivoted to serve African and Asian markets that welcomed their products. The decoupling wasn't clean. It wasn't efficient. It created redundancies and costs that integrated systems would have avoided. But it was happening. And with each passing month, the interdependence that had once made American economic leverage devastating became less relevant. Vladimir Petrov saw this transformation in his community. The Russian mathematics teacher who'd lost his retirement savings now lived in a country where Western brands had been replaced by Chinese and Indian alternatives. The products were different, the quality varied, but life continued. The economic apocalypse that Western analysts had predicted never materialized. Russia adapted, painfully, imperfectly, but undeniably. "The Americans thought sanctions would bring us to our knees," his neighbor observed during a conversation in November 2025. "They brought us to our feet. We learned to stand without them." Vladimir's response was more measured. "We learned to stand differently. Whether that's better or worse depends on what comes next. What came next was the announcement that reshuffled every calculation. December 2025. The BRICS Summit in Dubai. The host nation, the United Arab Emirates, had joined the bloc only a year earlier. Now, it was positioning itself as the financial bridge between the old system and the new. The summit's closing declaration contained a single paragraph that would dominate headlines for weeks. BRICS nations announced the launch of a multilateral settlement currency, denominated in a basket of member currencies and backed by gold reserves held in participating central banks. Not a replacement for national currencies, a supplement for international trade, a unit of account that no single country controlled. A 21st century answer to the Bancor that Keynes had proposed 80 years earlier at Bretton Woods. The currency would be called the unit. Its value would float against the dollar based on market forces. Its use would be voluntary. Its governance would be shared among member nations according to economic weight. China held the largest stake. India and Russia followed. But no country held veto power. No country could weaponize the system against others. The Western reaction ranged from dismissal to panic. A fantasy currency from fantasy economies, one American pundit declared on cable news. It'll collapse within a year. But the markets didn't share his confidence. Gold prices spiked 8% in the week following the announcement. The dollar index dropped 3%. Treasury yields rose as foreign holders quietly reduced their positions. The unit didn't need to succeed immediately. It just needed to exist. Its existence proved that alternatives were possible. James Morrison watched the news from his Ohio living room. Unemployment checks arriving monthly now. His company having finally succumbed to the competitive pressures it refused to adapt to. His wife sat beside him, silent. "We could have been ready for this," James said. 3 years ago, I told them. I showed them the numbers. I explained what was coming. They didn't want to hear it. No, they wanted to believe it couldn't happen, that America would always be on top, that the rules would never change. He laughed, hollow and tired. The rules changed. We didn't. Across the world, in Lagos, Amara Okonkwo opened a bottle of champagne with her team. The Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund had positioned itself perfectly for this moment. Their gold holdings had appreciated. Their yuan exposure was paying off. Their reduced dollar concentration meant reduced vulnerability to the chaos unfolding in currency markets. To diversification, Amara toasted, and to asking the right questions at the right time. Her team echoed the toast, but Amara's mind was already moving forward. The unit's launch was a beginning, not an ending. The real test would come in the months ahead. Could the system scale? Could it maintain stability? Could it resist the inevitable American attempts to undermine it? Safe for whom? She murmured, repeating her famous questions. Safe until when? Who decides? The answers were changing, and with them, the architecture of global finance was being rebuilt, transaction by transaction, node by node, in systems that the architects of Bretton Woods never imagined, and the defenders of dollar dominance couldn't stop. The consequences of that rebuilding would touch every person on Earth. Some would prosper. Some would suffer. Most would simply adapt, as humans always do, to the new realities that emerge when old systems fail to serve the people they claim to protect. Maria Santos sent her first unit-denominated invoice in January 2026. Zhang Wei's company opened a settlement account at a BRICS bridge participating bank. Chen Xiaoming finally felt safe enough to expand beyond the cautious boundaries he'd maintained since his destruction in 2018. Vladimir Petrov started teaching a new class, Introduction to Digital Currency Systems. Enrollment was full, and somewhere in Washington, officials who had spent decades assuming American financial dominance was permanent began to understand that permanence is an illusion, that systems built on trust cannot survive the abuse of that trust, that the only thing more dangerous than having enemies is creating them unnecessarily. The world they had known was ending. The world that would replace it was being born. And the birth, like all births, would be painful, messy, and ultimately unstoppable. The pattern repeats because the mechanism never changes. Bretton Woods in 1944. Nixon shock in 1971. The weaponization of SWIFT in 2022. The rise of BRICS pay in 2024. Different decades, different actors, same fundamental truth. Whoever controls the payment rails controls the game. The only question is whether you understand the rules before they're used against you. Vladimir Petrov understood too late. The Russian mathematics teacher, who lost $42,000 to sanctions he never anticipated, spent 3 years rebuilding something smaller, but more resilient. His new savings sit in gold, digital rubles, and a small apartment he owns outright. No foreign securities, no exposure to systems controlled by governments that consider him acceptable collateral damage. When his daughter asks about retirement, he tells her the truth. I'll work until I can't. But at least what I have, I actually have. His story isn't unique. It's universal. 3.5 million Russian citizens learned the same lesson. 5 million private investors discovered that participation in global markets meant accepting risks they'd never been told about. And across the developing world, from Nigeria to Brazil to India, central bankers watched and drew conclusions that will shape policy for generations. The dollar didn't fall because enemies attacked it. The dollar is falling because the people who depended on it discovered that dependence was the vulnerability. Maria Santos processes her invoices differently now. The Brazilian coffee exporter, who inherited her grandfather's struggle against currency manipulation, runs a business transformed by options he never had. 60% of her settlements flow through BRICS channels. The fees that once consumed her margins have dropped to rounding errors. The 5-day payment delays that disrupted her cash flow have become same-day settlements. She's not anti-American. She's pro-efficiency. The system that serves her better gets her business. That's not ideology. That's arithmetic. Her grandfather Roberto spent his career believing there was only one way to trade internationally. Maria knows better. She knows because alternatives exist now that didn't exist for him. She knows because she watched the system that claimed to be neutral reveal itself as a weapon. She knows because the evidence is in her bank statements, month after month, transaction after transaction. This is what systemic change looks like from the inside. Not dramatic collapses, not sudden revolutions. Quiet decisions by millions of individuals choosing efficiency over inertia, choosing sovereignty over dependence, choosing systems that serve their interests over systems that extract from them. Consider the framework that emerges from this story. 3 questions worth asking, not about what to buy or sell, but about how to see. First, what systems do you depend on that you don't control? Your banking relationships, your currency exposure, your payment infrastructure. Who operates these systems? What are their incentives? And what happens to you if those incentives change? Second, what would you do if access to those systems disappeared tomorrow? Not because you did anything wrong, not because you violated any law, but because someone in a distant capital decided that punishing your country required punishing you. Do you have alternatives? Could you build them? Third, who benefits from your ignorance about these questions? The institutions that profit from the current system have every incentive to minimize discussion of its vulnerabilities. The analysts who built careers on dollar dominance have every incentive to dismiss alternatives. The officials who wield financial weapons have every incentive to keep targets unaware until the moment of impact. These aren't predictions. They're prompts. What you do with them is your choice. The contrarian truth that most analysis still misses is this. The transition away from dollar dominance doesn't require the dollar to fail. It only requires alternatives to succeed. And alternatives are succeeding, right now, in ways that compound daily. 90% of BRICS trade in local currencies. The yuan at 8.5% of global forex volume and climbing. Gold purchases by non-Western central banks at record levels. BRICS Pay, processing billions in transactions that would have required American intermediaries 5 years ago. Each data point represents millions of individual decisions. Each decision represents someone who asked the questions and didn't like the answers. Picture a map of global payment flows, the dense arterial network that once centered entirely on New York and London, now sprouting new pathways through Shanghai and Moscow and Dubai. The architecture of commerce being rewired in real time. James Morrison never found another job in procurement. The Ohio manager who watched his company collapse under the weight of its refusal to adapt now consults for small businesses trying to navigate the fragmented landscape. His advice is simple and hard-won. Don't wait for permission to protect yourself. The people who make the rules aren't thinking about you. They're thinking about power. Your job is to think about survival. His clients listen because he speaks from experience, because he lost what they fear losing, because his scars prove his wisdom. Amara Okonkwo was promoted in January 2026. The Nigerian sovereign wealth analyst, who asked the 3 questions that no one wanted to hear, now leads her institution's Strategic Allocation Committee. Her first initiative, a comprehensive review of every dependency embedded in the fund's operations. Payment systems, custody arrangements, settlement mechanisms, currency exposure. She's mapping vulnerabilities that previous managers preferred not to see. The goal isn't to predict the future, she tells her team. The goal is to survive whatever future arrives. That requires honesty about where we're exposed and courage to reduce that exposure before it becomes a crisis. Honesty and courage. 2 qualities that the architects of dollar dominance assumed the rest of the world lacked. 2 qualities that the rest of the world is demonstrating daily. The signature line of this entire story might be this: trust is the only currency that can't be printed, and the only one that matters when systems fail. Bretton Woods was built on trust. The world trusted America to maintain gold convertibility. Nixon ended that trust in 1971. The dollar survived because the world trusted America to manage fiat currency responsibly. The sanctions of 2022 ended that trust for nations representing nearly half of humanity. What survives when trust is twice betrayed? Something new, something distributed, something no single power controls. That's not prophecy, that's observation. The evidence surrounds us. The transactions are recorded. The infrastructure is operational. The only remaining question is speed. And speed depends on how many more Vladimir Petrovs discover their savings can vanish. How many more Maria Santoses discover that alternatives work better? How many more countries watch their neighbors face financial weapons and decide not to wait for their turn? We started this video with a paradox. The dollar controls 88% of currency trades, while 45% of humanity builds systems to bypass it. That paradox is resolving, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet defection. Every business that switches to BRICS settlement, every central bank that diversifies reserves, every individual who asks why their economic security depends on decisions made in a foreign capital. The resolution won't be announced. It will be accumulated, transaction by transaction, node by node, choice by choice. The system that served the world for 80 years is being replaced by the systems that serve the world better. Not because America failed, because America succeeded too well at demonstrating what happens when financial power meets political will. The lesson was learned. The alternatives were built. The rest is mathematics. So where does that leave you? Not as a spectator to history, but as a participant in it. Every financial decision you make exists within systems you didn't design and may not understand. Every assumption about stability rests on foundations that are shifting beneath your feet. The question isn't whether change is coming. The question is whether you'll see it before it sees you. Vladimir Petrov teaches his students something that isn't in any textbook. Mathematics is the study of patterns, he says. And the most important pattern to recognize is the one you're standing inside. The pattern is clear now. The mechanism is visible. What remains is choice. The nations that will thrive in the coming decades are those that understood earliest and adapted fastest. The individuals who will prosper are those who asked uncomfortable questions, while others preferred comfortable ignorance. The systems that will endure are those built to serve their users rather than control them. This video was never about telling you what will happen. It was about showing you what is happening. The difference between prediction and observation is the difference between speculation and preparation. One is gambling. The other is wisdom. The dollar's dominance was never permanent. It was just familiar. And familiarity, as generations of financial casualties can testify, is not the same as safety. In the end, every empire learns the same lesson. You can control the system, or you can earn trust within it. You cannot do both forever. And when the choice comes, control always loses. The choice is here. The transition is underway. And the only certainty is this: the world that emerges will belong to those who saw it coming.